My name is Alva Rowen. I'm 34 years old, and I serve as a logistics command officer in the United States Army. In simple terms, I manage military transportation supplies, people humanitarian aid. It's not glamorous, it's not loud. But in a crisis, nothing moves without my say. Last week, I got an invitation to my mother's 60th birthday dinner. It came in the form of a 2-sentence email. No greeting, no warmth, just a date, time, and address. And a postscript written by my younger brother: please don't show up in uniform. We don't want people thinking you're struggling. I had to read that twice. They didn't want me looking like what I am. Because to them, a woman in fatigue still meant failed at something else. This wasn't new. 3 years ago, when I was promoted to major, my father asked me if I was done playing soldier. My mother once introduced me to her friend as our daughter, who works for the Army but not in combat, so it doesn't really count. And when I deployed overseas to support a humanitarian mission in the Middle East, my brother texted, "Good luck in whatever desert you're crawling around this time." They say words don't kill, but they do something worse. They chip away. Quietly, daily. Until one day you wake up and wonder if you've become a ghost in your own family. I wasn't going to go. I told myself that. Repeatedly. But something in that message, the arrogance, the dismissal, the need to control how I appear, pulled at something deeper, something that had been simmering for years. So I booked a flight, and I packed my uniform anyway. I didn't say yes to the invitation right away. The truth is, I stared at it for 3 days. Left it unread in my inbox, marked with a red flag, as if somehow urgency could manufacture meaning. But meaning was always optional in my family. Appearances, however, mandatory. I ran through the calculations in my head like I always do. Distance from base to home, 612 miles. Days off required 3. Mental toll of pretending to be welcome, immeasurable. And then came the other math. 4 family birthdays missed. 1 funeral I wasn't told about until 2 days after. 3 promotions never acknowledged. 1,000 nights overseas alone. 0 phone calls just to say, "How are you?" Some debts aren't about money. They're paid in silence, withheld hugs, and family photos you're cropped out of. From my bunk, I could hear the low hum of fluorescent lights. Another officer passed by my door, boots, crisp against linoleum. The base never sleeps. Not really. It pulses. Clockwork, steel doors, regulation sheets, coffee that tastes like burnt purpose. Here, everything made sense. There were rules, structures, ranks. If you did your job, you were valued. You didn't need to smile at meetings or laugh at your superior's jokes. You just had to deliver. In this world, I knew who I was. Back home, I was a puzzle piece that never fit. Too sharp at the edges, too quiet, too unwilling to become whatever version of Alva they needed to feel superior. But still, something about that message burned in me. Not just the condescension, but the assumption that I'd show up ashamed of who I am, that I'd edit myself for their comfort, that I'd shrink. And maybe, just maybe, I was done shrinking. I clicked confirm flight. 3 days, in and out, no expectations, no explanations. Just facts, orders, and 1 pressed uniform. Folded sharply, waiting. The seatbelt sign blinked on as we began our descent. I stared out the tiny oval window, watching the sun fall behind a stretch of cracked fields and suburban sprawl. Rows of identical rooftops. Neighborhoods built to feel safe, familiar, contained, like the house I grew up in. The last time we all sat down together, really sat down, was the night I told them I'd been accepted to West Point. I thought it would be a moment of pride. I imagined applause. Maybe a toast. Just one night of being seen. Instead, my father poured himself another glass of scotch and said, "You've always liked pretending to be strong, haven't you?" My mother just stared at her plate. She was slicing asparagus into perfect, anxious pieces. Thomas Jr. leaned back in his chair and laughed. "You in the military, who's going to iron your uniforms?" No one corrected him. No one defended me. And I still, 17, still hoping, just swallowed it. Chewed through dry chicken and 1,000 sharp silences. Later that night, I sat alone in the garage under the buzzing light, rereading my acceptance letter. The paper had a crease from being folded too many times. I held it like it was armor, like it could make me real to them. But it didn't. It never did. The flight jolted as we hit turbulence. I blinked back to the present. The man next to me was asleep, head tilted, mouth open. Across the aisle, a woman comforted a fussy toddler with a juice box and a song. The world moved on, unaware of the battlefield playing out in my chest. I reached into the small side pocket of my bag and pulled out the one thing I shouldn't have brought. My West Point ring, polished, heavy, earned. I turned it between my fingers slowly, as if I were remembering the weight of a life I built from scratch. A life no one in that dining room believed I could build. And yet I had. Not for them. But maybe, just maybe this time I'd let them see it, whether they liked it or not. The driveway hadn't changed. Same uneven concrete, same half-dead hedges. Even the wind chimes by the front porch still made that dull metallic clatter. For a second, I thought no one was home. Then the door opened. My father stood there in his navy golf sweater, arms crossed like a border guard. He didn't smile, didn't open the door wider. "You made it," he said flatly. "We weren't sure you'd actually come." I stepped over the threshold and replied with a nod. Not a word. He hated when I went silent. All the more reason to do it now. The house smelled like lemon polish and roast beef. The kind of scent that wanted to feel like warmth but didn't. Just another performance in a home built on half-truths and clean carpets. From the hallway I heard heels clicking. My mother appeared, perfectly coiffed, pearls in place. Her eyes scanned me like a scan at the airport, looking for threat or shame. "Oh, Alva," she said, drawing out my name. "You look so lean. Are you eating enough? You're starting to look a bit gaunt." That was her version of affection. Concern wrapped in judgment. A handshake with nails. "I'm fine," I replied. "Of course you are," she smiled thinly. "Always fine." Before the silence could settle, Thomas Jr. descended the staircase, like a politician arriving at a rally. He wore a designer jacket and held his phone like it was an extension of his ego. "Well, well," he grinned. "Our very own G.I. Jane. You get any medals for bossing around crates lately?" I smiled. "Just a little." He took it as encouragement, which was his first mistake. He leaned in for a hug I didn't return. The air between us smelled like expensive cologne and pride. "You won't believe the week I've had," he said, walking toward the kitchen without waiting for an answer. "Our firm's on the short list for a major Department of Defense contract. Big one. International scope. Logistics overhaul. I might be presenting to Pentagon reps next month." "Wow," my mother beamed. "Your father's going to be so proud." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because I had too many and none would have mattered in that moment. Instead, I stepped into the living room, dropped my bag by the edge of the couch, and scanned the walls. Not a single photo of me in uniform. Just Thomas at every graduation, every promotion, every step of the path they understood. And me, I was always the one who left. I walked through the house like a visitor in a museum curated by strangers. Every wall held something new. Paintings I didn't recognize, abstract shapes in golden frames. The old family photos had been relocated, replaced by canvases that looked expensive but meant nothing. Gone were the faded watercolors I made in 3rd grade. Gone, too, was the wooden clock my grandfather built by hand. Everything now was beige and metallic, polished and cold. The dog barked from the back patio. A golden retriever younger than I remembered. They must have gotten him after I left. "His name's Milo," my mother said, appearing beside me. "He's a rescue, very attached to Thomas." I stepped closer to the sliding door, crouched slightly, and called his name. "Milo," I said gently. He stared at me for a moment, then turned and trotted back toward the fence. So much for loyalty. The hallway to the bedrooms felt narrower than before. The floorboards creaked the same way they used to, except now the sound felt accusatory, like I was trespassing in a life that moved on without me. I stopped outside what used to be my room. The door was shut. I hesitated, then opened it slowly. Inside, there was no bed, no desk, no posters on the wall. Instead, stacks of boxes were piled high, labeled Christmas Dad's Tools. Tax returns 2011-2018. A rolled-up rug leaned in one corner. A folding chair sat in the middle like someone had once sat there briefly and never came back. The closet doors hung slightly ajar. Inside, no clothes. Just wire hangers, tangled lights, and a dented suitcase that used to be mine now serving as a shelf for dusty candles. I didn't step in. I couldn't. The space didn't recognize me, and maybe that was fair. Still, I ran my hand along the doorframe. It had a small chip on the side, a scar from when I slammed it shut after my father told me West Point wasn't a real future. I was 17, furious, determined, and still naive enough to think I'd change their minds. Behind me, my mother spoke softly. "We didn't think you'd be coming back." I didn't answer. I simply closed the door, carefully, without a sound, and walked back into a house that had already replaced me. Back in the guest room, formerly known as the sewing room, and before that the junk room, I opened my duffel bag and started to unpack. There wasn't much. 3 neatly folded shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 1 compact toiletry kit, and a book I never seemed to finish. Discipline teaches you to travel light. Expect nothing. Carry only what matters. I reached the bottom of the bag and paused. A small rectangular box wrapped in gray cloth sat nestled against the lining. I hadn't planned on bringing it. I wasn't sure why I did. I unwrapped it slowly like muscle memory. Inside were 5 medals, nothing ostentatious. Just polished metal and colored ribbons, symbols of moments no one in this house had ever asked me about. Symbols of decisions made under pressure, lives moved across continents, relief missions completed without recognition. I held one between my fingers. The ribbon was frayed at the edges. Dust clung to the corners of the box like a quiet insult. I didn't display them. I never had. Not here, not in this house. Instead, I turned them all face down, not out of shame, out of refusal. Refusal to offer more evidence to people who had already made up their minds. I sat on the edge of the narrow twin bed, my back straight, eyes fixed on the box. And then the memory came uninvited, sharp. The day I deployed for the first time. 19 years old. Backpack heavier than my body could handle. Heart racing like it knew something I didn't. I stood on the curb outside the base shuttle stop, scanning the empty parking lot. No one came. No father leaning against the car in quiet pride. No mother with a care package or tearful hug. No Thomas. Just a driver who didn't know my name and didn't ask. We rode in silence for 2 hours. I remember watching other soldiers say goodbye to their families. Some cried, some laughed. All were held. I had nothing to hold on to except orders. When I reached the airstrip, I asked the supply officer if there was a place to make a phone call. He pointed to a broken payphone and said, "You can try, but don't bet on it." I didn't. I boarded the plane, alone. And in a strange way, I think that was the moment I stopped trying to come home. At least not to this one. The dining room looked like a magazine spread. Candles flickered in crystal holders. A centerpiece of white roses sat atop a lace runner. My mother had gone all out as always. A performance disguised as celebration. And we were all expected to play along. I took my seat at the far end of the table. Not assigned, but understood. Distance was tradition. Thomas Jr. sat at the head, laughing too loudly at something our father had said. He wore a blazer that looked custom-made and a confidence that wasn't. My mother stood, champagne flute in hand, and cleared her throat. To family, she began with the kind of smile that stretched but didn't settle. And to Thomas, whose team has just been shortlisted for a major defense contract, nationwide logistics. Truly remarkable. Everyone lifted their glasses. My father nodded proudly, then added, "If this goes through, Thomas will be coordinating directly with federal agencies. A big leap. The kind of thing that opens doors in D.C. More clinking, more praise." I sipped water. Thomas grinned, playing coy. "It's early, of course. Nothing final. But the fact that we're even being considered says a lot." He looked at me when he said that. Just for a second. Not in invitation, not in shared language, but in conquest. Like he'd won something and I'd forgotten we were competing. My mother placed a hand on his arm. "We always knew you'd rise, sweetheart. You've got the Carter drive." I glanced down at my plate. Chicken breast, asparagus, potatoes piped like pastry. Precision without warmth. No one asked what I'd been working on. No one asked how many units I'd moved through conflict zones, or how often my decisions had fed, evacuated, or saved lives. Because those stories don't belong in rooms like this. Not when there's a preferred narrative to maintain. I thought of the medals in my bag, face down in a dusty box. And I reminded myself that silence can be sharper than any retort. Sometimes the best answer is none at all. The toast ended and the conversations turned casual. Forks scraped against porcelain. Glasses refilled themselves. Everyone resumed their roles with ease, my father the stern host, my mother the polished orchestrator, Thomas Jr. the golden son. And then came the inevitable question. So my mother said, dabbing her mouth with a napkin, "What are you doing these days?" Alva, her tone was light, almost bored. I placed my knife and fork down carefully. "Still serving," I said. "I'm with the United States Transportation Command. We coordinate strategic movements, personnel, equipment, aid shipments. Most recently, I oversaw a multi-theater deployment in the Pacific." There was a pause, not the respectful kind, the kind that swells with something unsaid. My father chuckled. It was low and dry. "Still in logistics," then he said, slicing into his meat. "So paperwork and boxes, you push supplies around so others can do the real work." I didn't flinch. I've heard worse. Just never at a table set for 12. Thomas grinned. Sounds like a glorified moving company. No one corrected him. No one blinked. No one asked what happens when fuel doesn't arrive on time in a war zone, or how a single misrouted crate can cost lives, or how last year I rerouted entire relief shipments from a flooded base in Guam, saving 3 villages from collapse. But those stories don't belong here. Not when they can't be turned into anecdotes. Not when the room is already full of certainty. I took another sip of water. It tasted like melted ice and restraint. My mother turned the conversation back to Thomas, his pitch deck, his government liaison, the brilliant way he phrased his value proposition. And I sat there listening, not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd learned painfully and repeatedly that some people don't want conversation. They want confirmation of their own brilliance, of their own versions of you. And in their version, I was small. So I stayed quiet, but inside me something shifted. Not rage, not grief. Something steadier, like steel cooling into shape. Somewhere between the third course and dessert, the conversation took its predictable turn. So my mother said, adjusting her pearl bracelet, like it was part of the question, "Are you seeing anyone these days?" "Alva." I looked up from my plate, meeting her eyes. "No," I replied, simply, cleanly. She didn't flinch. She just smiled, tight-lipped and perfectly rehearsed. Well, she continued, "You're not getting any younger, you know. Your cousin Lydia just had her second baby. And Benjamin, he's already bought a house in Connecticut. Lovely backyard, great schools." Thomas Jr. chimed in without missing a beat. "She's married already, Mom. To the Army. Deployment dates instead of anniversaries. Medals instead of rings." He laughed at his own joke. No one else did. But no one stopped him either. My father cleared his throat the way he always did when he wanted a change in topic, without having to request it directly. The room fell quiet for a second, and I could hear the air conditioning humming above us, steady and cold. I set my fork down, slowly, deliberately, and for a brief, dangerous moment, I almost told them. About the time I did fall in love with a medic stationed in Okinawa. About the way we made plans for a future that didn't involve combat boots and green zones. And how after my 3rd deployment, I came home to an empty apartment and a note that said, "You're built for battle." I'm not. But I didn't tell them. Because they wouldn't have understood. Because to them, pain is only valid if it fits their version of your life. I took a sip of water. It went down like glass. My mother leaned in as if I hadn't answered the question correctly. "Sweetheart, you've built such an impressive career. But don't you ever want a stability, a home, a family, something lasting?" Something lasting. I looked around the table, at the cracked relationships dressed up in fine linens, at the conversations stitched with pride and subtle cruelty, at a house filled with everything except what I had once begged for: recognition, understanding, belonging. Something lasting. I already had it. I had my oath, my record, my silence hardened, weathered, and mine. They wanted me to settle, but what they really meant was shrink, soften, disappear into something familiar. I smiled, and gave them exactly what they'd trained me to give. Nothing. I stopped hearing them at some point. The voices around the table blurred into background noise: forks, clinking glasses, touching chairs, scraping slightly as people shifted in their seats. I watched my mother gesture as she spoke, her fingers moving with the same precision she used to fold linens. My father's voice hummed low, steady like static. Thomas laughed at something, probably his own story, but I wasn't there anymore. My eyes had locked onto something else, Something quiet. A porcelain bowl. It sat near the center of the table, half full of roasted vegetables, white with a blue trim. Harmless. But right there near the rim was a crack, faint but visible, like a line of old lightning frozen into ceramic. I knew that bowl, not just the pattern, the crack. I put it there. I was 9, maybe 10. We were having dinner, some family gathering I can't remember what for. But I do remember feeling invisible. I had tried to tell a story, something that happened at school, but no one listened. Everyone kept talking over me, laughing at other things. I kept raising my voice until my mother snapped, "Alva, lower your tone. This isn't about you." Something inside me snapped too. I reached for the bowl to pass it, but my grip was off. It slipped, shattered on the hardwood floor. Silence, not the stunned kind, not even angry, just cold. My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just stood, picked up the largest piece, examined it, and left the room. My mother said I had embarrassed her. Thomas smirked. No one helped me clean it up. Later, they didn't yell. That would have meant they still felt something. Instead, they ignored me. For 2 days. No eye contact. No answers. Meals left outside my door like I was contagious. That was the first time I learned the weight of silence. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that makes you question whether you were ever really there. Now, years later, that same cracked bowl was on their table. Used, polished, preserved, as if pretending it hadn't broken would make it whole again. I stared at it like it might speak. It didn't, and neither did I, because somewhere deep inside I realized they didn't see the crack as a flaw. They saw it as mine. I needed air, the kind that doesn't smell like lemon polish and family history. So I slipped out the back door, past the hedges, down the stone path my father once complained about every summer, but never fixed. The night was colder than I expected. My breath came out in short clouds. I didn't bring a jacket, but the chill felt good. Sharp, real. I walked past the mailboxes, past the cul-de-sac where we used to ride bikes. Most of the houses looked the same, though some had new shutters or bigger driveways. A few porch lights were still on. Inside, families were finishing dinner, watching TV, putting kids to bed. I reached the corner and stopped. Someone was sitting on the low brick wall outside the Lamberts' old house, legs outstretched, head tilted up to the stars. He looked older than I remembered, but there was no mistaking the face. "Benji," I said, half unsure. He turned slowly. "Alva." His voice cracked on the first syllable. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. I used to babysit him when I was in high school, back when he was small and wild, obsessed with toy helicopters and dinosaurs. Now he had facial hair, broader shoulders, and a slight limp that made his right leg drag just a second behind the left. "You're back," he said, standing. For good, I shook my head. "Just visiting. You?" He shrugged. "Sort of. I got back 6 months ago. VA put me in physical therapy, still figuring things out." He didn't need to say where he'd been. The way he held his weight on one side told the story. "I heard you were in too," he added. "Weird how we both ended up there." I nodded. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "They don't really get it, do they?" "No," I replied. "They don't." We stood there in the quiet, two ghosts who had walked the same streets as children and now returned as strangers. When we said goodbye, he gripped my arm, not hard, just enough to say, "I see you." And for the first time all day, I felt like someone did. Back at the hotel, I peeled off my boots, let my hair down, and sat on the edge of the bed. The room smelled like cheap soap and filtered air, but at least it was mine. Clean, contained, silent. I opened my laptop. It required a multi-step login, encrypted server, dual authentication, a retinal scan if I were on base. But tonight, just my fingerprint and passphrase. The screen loaded, and there it was, my world. United States Transportation Command, Division 7 Oversight Operations, Strategic Contract Evaluation Clearance Level, Tier 4, Military Asset Discretion Active. The words looked sterile to most people, but I knew what they meant. They meant I saw things most civilians never would. I clicked into the day's priority roster, a filtered spreadsheet listing companies flagged for direct evaluation before contract renewal. These were not small players. These were global suppliers' names whispered in the corners of defense summits and multinational briefings. I scrolled. Most of the names were familiar. I'd seen them in supply chain disruption models, fuel route projections, cyber infrastructure audits. Then I stopped. Line 37, Synercom Dynamics, Eastern Division location, Virginia contract, type dual-use logistics, pending renewal $186 million USD primary POC, Thomas Carter Jr. I stared at the screen, not shocked, just still. I had never connected the company name to Thomas before. He always referred to it as the firm or my sector. Vague titles, clever distancing. But now here it was, under review, under me. I double-checked the routing protocol. The case hadn't yet been assigned to an external analyst, which meant by default it stayed with me. My cursor hovered over the file. One click and I'd open every internal audit performance review risk note and compliance record linked to Thomas's division. I didn't click. Not yet. I leaned back, letting the screen dim. Not out of hesitation, not out of fear, but because I knew what came next would not be accidental. I had a choice to make. And this time I would not make it small. I didn't open the Synercom file, not yet. Instead, I stared at the faint glow of my screen and thought about the last time I had to make a decision that changed everything. It wasn't glamorous. Nothing in logistics ever is. No medals, no headlines, just a ticking clock and a series of numbers that either work or don't. We were midway through a NATO joint exercise codenamed Winter Forge, coordinated out of Wiesbaden, Germany. The weather had turned faster than predicted. Roads were flooding across southern Europe. Our pre-cleared routes into northern Africa were compromised. Civilian evacuation routes crossed into our corridors. One error in the entire exercise could become a humanitarian disaster. 12 tons of medical aid and water purification systems were stalled on tarmac in Germany. The scheduled cargo ship in Spain was grounded. The window to redirect was closing by the hour. No one told me what to do. That's the thing about real command, they don't ask for permission. They ask for accountability. I bypassed the Spanish port entirely. I rerouted 3 C-17s out of Ramstein and coordinated emergency runway clearance in Rabat. The Moroccan base wasn't designed for that scale of operation. But I called in favors, woke up people I hadn't spoken to in years, pulled airspace strings through channels that had nothing to do with the official playbook. Within 6 hours, we had a clear lane and a crew in motion. The aid landed. On time. Unannounced. No delays, no press. Just 12 tons of quiet consequence. A week later, I got a commendation letter from a health minister I'd never met. But I didn't frame it, didn't show it to anyone. Because that's not why we do it. We don't move parts, we move outcomes. And if you do it right, no one even knows your name. That's the job. I leaned back in the hotel chair and let the memory settle like dust. No one in my family would have believed that story. Not because it sounded unrealistic, but because to them, I'd never been more than a footnote. To them, logistics meant boxes. To me, it meant lives. And that difference, quiet, crucial, invisible, was where I lived. The cursor blinked on the empty line. My hand hovered over the keyboard for a moment, not from hesitation, but ritual. I've written thousands of official memos. They never get easier, not the real ones. I clicked open the secure submission portal and started typing. Memo to Oversight Logistics Command, Tier FA Evaluation Unit, Recontract Evaluation, Synercom Dynamics, Eastern Division. Appearing in person, disclose conflict of interest. No mention until NDA clearance. Simple, direct. No flair, no room for misinterpretation. I paused before hitting submit. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I knew what came next wouldn't be something I could walk away from quietly. Once I appeared in uniform, once I walked into that room as Colonel Rowen, not Alva, the sister, everything changed. There'd be no pulling it back. No plausible deniability, no safe distance. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about pride. It was clarity. If someone else had been assigned to review Synercom, I would have recused myself. No questions asked. But they hadn't. And now that I knew silence would be complicity. So I did what I always do. I followed the rules. But I made sure they were my rules too. I clicked submit. The system sent back an encrypted acknowledgement. I archived the receipt. Redundant maybe, but protocols keep you sharp. Sharp keeps you alive. I leaned back in the chair. The hotel room felt colder now, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. Maybe it was the knowledge. Maybe it was knowing that come morning I wouldn't just be walking into a meeting. I'd be walking into a collision, because Thomas didn't know. My father didn't know. No one at that table had the faintest clue that the person they kept pushing to the corner seat was the same person who now held the authority to pause restructure or cancel the very contract they celebrated. But I wasn't going there to destroy anything. I was going to listen, to observe, to document, and to make a decision based on the data, not the name on the file. That's what integrity means when no one's watching. It's not about being above conflict. It's about walking into it steady, unarmed, knowing you don't need noise to hold power, just a spine and a signature. The alarm went off at 5:30, old habit. I didn't need to be up that early, but routine has a way of grounding you when emotion threatens to pull you apart. I made coffee in silence, drank it black, no sugar, no cream, just heat and bitterness. It helped. My uniform hung perfectly pressed in the closet, olive green, rank insignia glinting faintly under the lamplight. The nameplate said Rowen. That was enough. It had been months since I'd worn full dress blues. Most of my assignments didn't require them. But today wasn't about protocol. It was about presence. I stood in front of the mirror and took a long breath before slipping the jacket over my shoulders. The weight was familiar, centering, as if every decision I'd made to get here was sewn into the fabric. I straightened the collar, checked the buttons, smoothed the creases. Then I pinned my West Point ring onto the inside flap. A quiet reminder, a private defiance. By the time I stepped into the hotel lobby, the morning sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The concierge looked up from his desk. He blinked once, then stood taller. "Good morning, Colonel Rowen," he said. Just like that. No hesitation, no commentary, no smirk. He saw the uniform. He saw the rank. And he said the name. It hit me harder than I expected. Not because I needed validation from a stranger, but because it was the first time in days, maybe years, that someone said my name without shrinking it. Back at the house, they called me a burden. Here I was, Colonel Rowen. And for once those two truths couldn't coexist. I nodded politely, walked toward the car waiting at the curb. My boots clicked against marble tile measured firm. I didn't rush. I didn't smile. Inside the vehicle, I opened the folder I'd brought with me. Synercom Dynamics Eastern Division. Primary POC Thomas Carter Jr. Scheduled presentation 0900 hours. I had 20 minutes to arrive, 10 minutes to review, and a lifetime of silence to carry in with me. I looked down at the folder again. This wasn't revenge. This was recognition delivered without apology, dressed in full uniform, and standing exactly where I was meant to be. The car ride back to the house was silent, except for the low hum of the tires and the occasional email ping from Thomas Jr.'s phone. He slid into the passenger seat, like a man prepping for a TED Talk watch, glinting blazer, freshly pressed hair, exactly as intentional as his smile. I sat behind him. No one offered the front seat. No one noticed the uniform. He was already on a call. "Yeah, we're finalizing visuals now," he said, tapping the phone against his thigh. Executive summary first lean sharp makes us sound indispensable. Then we hit them with the data, clean but heavy, a pause. Then laughter. I know, right? They're gonna eat it up. Especially once they see the Department of Defense projections we tied in. I watched the back of his head, the way he nodded slightly with every sentence. Like he was confirming a mirror's reflection. "We've got their logistics system modeled down to the cubic inch," he continued. "If this goes well, I'm telling you we'll have a foot in federal contracts for a decade." He didn't glance back at me, not once. Didn't ask what I was wearing, didn't wonder where I was headed. Didn't notice that my boots were polished within regulation standards, or that my posture was straight, not from pride, but from habit. To him, I was just a body sharing the vehicle. Background. He ended the call with a confident, "See you inside," and turned to our father as we pulled up. "Dad, they said they might send someone from federal today," he said casually. "Just a formality. Probably just legal or compliance." Our father nodded, distracted. "Just make sure you speak clearly. Don't rush." I never do. I stepped out of the car without a word. He didn't stop me, didn't ask where I was going, didn't ask why I wasn't carrying a briefcase, didn't ask why I hadn't taken my uniform off. It struck me not as insult, but inevitability. People don't ask questions when they've already decided your role, and Thomas had decided long ago that mine was too far removed from relevance to matter. I walked toward the crosswalk. The sound of my boots echoed off the sidewalk, sharp, deliberate, alone. He went right, I went left. And that was the last moment he still believed he understood who I was. The corporate building stood like a monument to itself. Glass walls, sleek lines, and too much marble in the lobby for a company that filed quarterly budget requests labeled lean. I stepped inside. The air was refrigerated and scented with something floral artificial. My boots echoed louder than anyone else's shoes. Most of the people wore designer suits and ID lanyards like jewelry. I wore command bars and steel resolve. The front desk receptionist smiled automatically until her eyes scanned my uniform. She paused. Do you have an appointment, ma'am? I handed her my credentials without speaking. She blinked twice, then stood up. Of course, Colonel Rowen. Right this way. No one had ever stood up for me in this family before. The irony stung, but I buried it like everything else. We walked past rows of executives on glass phones, projectors glowing with bullet points I could recite in my sleep. Everything looked sharp, successful, ready for PR. But I knew how fragile these places were under audit. Just one line item in the wrong column could send it all spinning. Security stopped me at the elevator. A tall man in a navy blazer looked down at my badge, then back up at me. I need to verify this clearance, he said. Please do, I replied. He scanned it, twice, then checked it against a printed list. His eyes widened slightly. You're with Tier 4, I nodded. Sorry, ma'am, he said quickly. Didn't realize we had oversight from that level. You do today. He let me through. I stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed with a quiet hiss. Inside, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. My eyes were darker than usual, sleeplessness etched in the corners. I hadn't truly slept in 2 days. Between paperwork memory and the ache of coming back to a house that never asked you to return rest, had felt irrelevant. But my spine was straight. My steps were even. If they were looking for cracks, they wouldn't find any here. I adjusted my collar and focused on the present. Tactical briefing memorized. Contract data reviewed. NDA disclosure logged. I wasn't here to punish. I was here to observe, to measure what they claimed against what they delivered, and maybe quietly to remind a boardroom full of men in $1,000 suits that power doesn't always arrive in the form they expect. The elevator dinged. A junior staffer stood waiting to escort me. He looked 22 maybe. His voice cracked slightly when he said, "Right this way, Colonel." We walked down a hallway flanked with glass offices. People peeked up from their monitors. Some nodded. Most stared. They didn't see a Carter. They didn't see a burden. They saw a uniform, a nameplate, a presence. And for the first time in a long time, that was exactly what I intended. The boardroom was larger than I expected. Long walnut table, frosted windows, 12 black leather chairs arranged like they were expecting someone important. Bottled water at every seat, notebooks, laptops, a wall-mounted screen already lit with the Cinercom logo. I stepped through the glass doors. The room went still. Mr. Delacroix's CEO suit, tailored down to the angle of his shoulders, was mid-sentence when he saw me. He stopped speaking, stood. "Colonel Rowen," he said, his voice clear and immediate. "Thank you for joining us." There was a beat of silence. Then two. My father turned toward the sound of my name, then Thomas. For a moment their faces were mirrors, both frozen in a kind of delayed recognition. Not because they didn't see me, but because they didn't know how to process what they were seeing. I stepped forward, boots clicking against the polished floor. Not too fast, not too slow. Mr. Delacroix extended his hand. "Your presence is appreciated. We understand Tier 4 doesn't usually appear in person unless I review all active logistics contract renewals exceeding $150 million, I replied. "And when direct relations are involved, I attend personally." I didn't look at Thomas when I said it, but I could feel the shift. The room rearranged itself around my presence. Conversations halted. Eyes focused. Not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't need to. "Of course," Delacroix said, gesturing to the chair nearest him. "We've made space for you here." I took the seat. Not at the corner, not in the back, but at the center of the table, where decisions are made. Thomas hadn't moved. His hand rested on the back of a chair, lips slightly parted, like a sentence had gotten lost between brain and mouth. My father sat down slowly, stiffly. I saw him glance at the insignia on my shoulder. I saw the math happening in his head, trying to reconcile the uniform in front of him with the daughter he had spent years minimizing. I didn't give him a way out. No smile, no nod, just stillness. A junior associate fumbled with the clicker, trying to launch the presentation slides. Someone cleared their throat. Another reached for water they didn't drink. The silence wasn't awkward. It was earned. Because for the first time I wasn't just in the room. I was the reason the room held its breath. I unfolded the binder slowly. No rush, no drama, just sequence. A junior associate handed me a printed copy of the presentation agenda. I barely looked at it. I'd already memorized every item, every supporting document, every contract deviation, dating back 2 fiscal quarters. Before we begin, I said, voice steady, I'd like to offer a brief summary of Tier IV's position. Chairs creaked slightly as people sat straighter. Over the past 6 months, I continued Synercom Dynamics, has submitted proposals for integrated military logistics support totaling $186 million. All 3 bids fall under my direct jurisdiction. Given the scope, this review is not routine. It's strategic. I heard someone swallow hard. Not theatrically, just human. I kept going. Our office has examined performance benchmarks, subcontractor histories, fulfillment, consistency, and contingency adaptability. Today's session is not to approve or reject, but to validate. That distinction is important. I let the silence settle for a second. Then I looked down the table. Mr. Carter, I said, without emotion, you may proceed with your presentation. Thomas blinked. His hand twitched toward the remote control, fumbling slightly before pressing the button. The first slide lit up a polished title card, Redefining Readiness. His voice came out, not small exactly, but uncertain. Thank you, Colonel. And thank you all for being here. Pause. A visible inhale. Our goal with this proposal is to streamline logistical operations across all active theaters by incorporating Synercom's proprietary forecasting Model 1 that's already proven effective in civilian deployment chains. I watched his forehead bead with sweat. He tapped the slide forward. Bullet points, acronyms, words like efficiency, redundancy, mitigation, flex load optimization. I said nothing, just took notes. Let him fill the space with all the confidence he could summon. Let the weight of my silence do what no confrontation ever could. By the 3rd slide, he mispronounced a term. By the 5th, he stopped looking at me. And by the time he reached his conclusion, his voice barely above a practiced murmur, he knew that the room didn't belong to him anymore. It never had. After the meeting recessed for a short break, I stepped out of the boardroom and walked toward the far end of the corridor. No one followed at first. The hallway was lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was a gray morning, the kind that flattened everything into one shade building's sky memory. I stood there, hands lightly folded behind my back eyes, fixed on nothing in particular, just letting the silence press against me. This wasn't the kind of quiet that begged to be broken. It was the kind that had weight, that could hold its own. I heard footsteps behind me, steady, familiar. I didn't turn. He stopped beside me, just close enough to share the view, not the air. We stood like that for a long time, not speaking, not shifting. The only movement came from the slow crawl of fog against glass. My father, Thomas Carter Sr., the man who once said discipline didn't count unless it came with a title he could understand. The man who measured worth in deliverables, partnerships, corporate influence. The man who asked if I was done playing soldier after my 2nd deployment. That man now stood beside me with no script, no defense, no certainty. Still, he said nothing. I wondered what he saw out the window, the skyline, or the distance between the woman beside him and the girl he once refused to drive to the airport. He didn't apologize, and I didn't expect him to. Sometimes silence is all that's left when the scaffolding of denial falls too fast to rebuild. I didn't speak either, not out of spite, but because nothing I could say would make this moment more true. There was no victory in it, no triumph, just recognition, just the faint sound of 2 people breathing in the space where a wall used to be. His hands were clenched lightly at his sides. His wedding ring caught the light once, then didn't again. We stayed there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe longer, and then without a word he stepped back, walked away, not hurried, not ashamed, just quiet. And that was the difference. Because this wasn't silence anymore, it was surrender. Dinner was quieter than the last one. Same table, same plates. But something had changed. There was a tension in the room, not sharp, just dense, like the air had weight, like everyone had just remembered how to breathe but forgot how to speak. I sat where I always did, at the far end. Thomas barely touched his food. My father drank his water slower than usual. And my mother, always the conductor, wasn't conducting anything. She just kept smoothing the edge of her napkin with 2 fingers, over and over. Then halfway through the roasted chicken and green beans she spoke. "I never understood what you did." Her voice was soft, unsteady. She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at her plate. "That scared me," she added, not knowing, not being able to explain it to my friends, not being able to talk about it without sounding foolish. I didn't move. This wasn't an apology. It was something else. "I think I used that fear as an excuse," she continued. "To act like it wasn't real. To act like you were just off doing something difficult to explain instead of something important." She finally looked up. And for the first time in years, her eyes didn't hold judgment. They held distance. The kind that comes after looking in the wrong direction for too long. "I'm sorry," she said, "for not trying harder to understand." The table stayed quiet. My father didn't interrupt. Thomas didn't scoff. I didn't answer right away, because I needed to sit with it, to measure it, to feel whether it came from guilt or from truth. She didn't fill the silence. She just let it exist. That more than anything told me this wasn't performance. I reached for my fork again, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a way to say, "I heard you." We ate the rest of the meal in relative peace. No more questions. No resumes recited. No comparisons made. And that was enough for now. It was Thomas who spoke next. Not with the bravado I'd grown used to. Not with the smooth, polished tone of someone pitching to investors or easing into a boardroom joke. This time his voice was smaller, cautious, like someone stepping into a room that might collapse underfoot. "I think I'm going to take a leave from work." No one moved. He looked down at his plate, then back up, scanning the room for something, approval maybe, or just acknowledgement that the words had landed. I pushed too fast," he continued. "Didn't see the gaps." He didn't say what gaps he meant, but I knew, the ones between confidence and competence, between assumption and understanding, between thinking you're untouchable and realizing someone else has been holding the floor beneath you all along. Thomas reached for his water glass. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted it. I thought I could talk my way through anything he said. That if I sounded right, looked right, moved fast enough, it would all stay under control. He wasn't looking at me when he said it, but it didn't matter. The admission was real. Raw in a way I hadn't seen from him since we were kids. Our mother said nothing, just watched. My father stared at his hands. Thomas continued. "I didn't just miss details in the proposal. I missed people. I missed context. I didn't stop to ask who was in the room or why they were there or what they might already know." He finally looked at me, and for once his expression wasn't defensive. It wasn't jealous. It wasn't anything I recognized from all the versions of him I'd been forced to sit across from. It was something new. "I didn't see you," he said. "I thought I did. But I didn't. I didn't speak. He didn't expect me to. That was the difference." This wasn't a confession dressed up as apology. It was a man slowly realizing the size of his own shadow, and that maybe it never reached as far as he imagined. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it. But something settled in the silence between us, something honest, and that for the first time felt like enough. I let the silence stretch, long enough for my mother's apology to settle, long enough for Thomas's admission to land without echo, long enough for me to feel the weight of being seen not as a burden, not as a disappointment, not as a concept, but as a person. Then I spoke. I didn't come back to be proven right. My voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It just existed. I didn't fly across the country, put on this uniform, walk into that room today, so someone here would say I was worth something. If that was what I needed, I'd have cracked years ago. They listened. Not politely, fully. I came because I thought maybe after all this time I could finally be seen. I looked at my mother, then at Thomas, then at my father. I'm not asking for applause. I'm not even asking for understanding. I'm just telling you what's true. I placed my napkin down neatly beside my plate. All these years, I watched you all build a world where I didn't fit. You celebrated Thomas because you knew the shape of his success. You could name it, explain it, wrap it in stories that sounded good at dinner parties. I didn't say it bitterly. I said it like I was reading from a file. But when it came to me, you didn't even ask. You assumed. You filled in blanks that weren't yours to write. I paused not for effect, but because I felt the truth catch in my throat, not as pain, but as release. I don't need validation from people who never bothered to understand what I do. I came home because some part of me, however foolish, still wanted you to look at me and not flinch, not look away, not rewrite me into someone easier to love. I let that sit. No one interrupted. I'm not angry, I said finally. Not anymore. Anger needs hope. And I let go of that a long time ago. My mother closed her eyes for a moment. My father looked down. Thomas didn't move. I'm still proud of who I am, I added. Proud of what I've built, even if no one in this house watched me do it. And then I exhaled. Not because I was done speaking, but because I was finally done carrying what I hadn't said. I left after breakfast. No drama, no declarations. I didn't say I was leaving. I just began to move. One bag zipped. One key returned to its hook. One uniform folded back into its place. The house didn't try to stop me. No one chased me down the hallway or begged me to stay. But for the first time, their silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like understanding. Maybe not full, maybe not perfect, but real. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, the tires rolling over pavement that had once carried bikes and scraped knees, and childhood versions of me they never quite let go of. The sun had just begun to break through the clouds, casting faint lines of gold across the dashboard. The road stretched long and flat ahead of me, familiar, but different. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel, tighter than usual, not from anger, from release, because everything I'd held in, every insult swallowed, every moment I'd shrunk to keep their peace, had been spoken. Not shouted, not thrown, just laid down. Truthfully, finally. My hands stayed firm at 10 and 2. I could still feel the echo of the Boardroom Delacroix's voice, the stillness, the shifting weight of eyes as I took my seat. I could still hear Thomas's stumble, see my father's hands at his sides, remember my mother's eyes as they softened for the first time in years. None of that changed the past, but it changed me. I wasn't leaving in defiance. I was leaving as someone who had said what needed to be said and had nothing left to prove. At the next light, I rolled the window down a crack. The air smelled clean, dry leaves and morning dust. Somewhere down the highway, the base waited just another check-in, just another Monday. But something in me felt different, lighter, not because I'd been forgiven, not because I'd won, but because I'd stood, fully and still. That was enough. Months passed. The seasons shifted without fanfare. I returned to base life, the rhythm of systems and silence orders and optimization. My office stayed orderly, my inbox less so. I heard about the changes through other channels. My father had retired quietly, no ceremony, no mention, just gone from the directory. Thomas Jr. sent a single-line message weeks later. He's spending time on the boat more now. That felt right. For a man who measured worth by control, stepping back must have felt like drowning. Or maybe it was his first breath in decades. I didn't ask. But it was my mother's name that surprised me. Buried at the end of a weekly newsletter from the Armed Services Family Initiative, Evelyn Rowen joins as volunteer coordinator at our support center in Arlington. I stared at the name for longer than I should have. No call, no email, just that line. A month later, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside a photo, blurry, slightly crooked. My mother standing between two young women in civilian clothes, a box of care kits on the table beside them. Her hands mid-gesture, her smile. Not the one I remembered, softer, less posed. On the back of the photo, one sentence in her handwriting. Thank you for teaching me what service looks like. That was all. No apology, no grand reconnection. Just 7 words that held more truth than anything she'd spoken in years. I didn't frame the photo, I didn't reply, but I didn't throw it away either. I slipped it into a drawer, the same one that held the cracked ceramic bowl I'd taken from the house on my last day, wrapped in cloth still broken, still whole, in its own way. Some things don't need fixing. They just need to be seen. They gave me a clicker, a lapel mic, and a quiet room that smelled like marker ink and polished floor wax. I stood at the front, not in uniform this time. No stars, no stripes. Just a navy blouse and gray slacks. Civilian. Still me. Rows of young cadets filled the seminar room. Some whispered when I entered. Others straightened their backs as if I could still order them to drop and give me 20. I didn't. I just smiled, nodded once, and clicked to the first slide. Operational Chaos versus Tactical Clarity. That was the title. I walked them through the math of misjudged payloads, the poetry of terrain lines, the art of rerouting under fire. I told them how information wins before boots touch dirt. Not stories from the battlefield, but blueprints from behind the curtain where victories are built, not just fought. They listened like it mattered, because it does. Midway through, a cadet raised her hand. She asked how to handle doubt, how to stay calm when everything shifts mid-operation. I paused, then said, "You don't fight the chaos. You learn to move inside it." And I saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition maybe, or belief. When the session ended, some stayed behind. One lingered near the projector cart, fiddling with his pen before asking, "Ma'am, what's the one thing you wish someone told you?" When you started, I didn't need to think. That it's okay to be invisible. For a while. But you better know your own weight before anyone else does. He didn't write it down, just nodded as if storing it in a place deeper than notes. Later, alone in the hallway, I saw my reflection in the glass. No badges, no medals, just me. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was missing anything. The light in my quarters fell soft across the wooden desk. The box sat in front of me, scuffed tape twice over corners softened from years of storage. I lifted the lid. Inside, the medals were still there. Bronze, silver, the commendation for operational excellence in Allied zones. My name engraved in letters so sharp they could still cut. But they didn't glitter anymore. They simply sat there silent and weighty like truth that no longer needed to shout. I repacked them one by one. Not because I had something to prove. Not anymore. I just wanted them closer now. Not in a dusty box, not in a drawer where silence lives. Closer. Beside the medals, I placed the bowl. That same cracked porcelain bowl from the dining room, the one I'd carried out wrapped in a sweater, unsure why I'd taken it. One long fracture curled through the side, like a scar that never closed right. I hadn't glued it, hadn't filled it. It just sat there broken and honest. I liked it that way. The bowl held nothing, but it contained more than anything I'd brought back. I sat for a while, thought of my mother's voice softening at the dinner table, unsure of how to say I was wrong. Of my father standing beside me, not speaking, but not walking away either. Of Thomas Jr. staring down at his hands and seeing something other than confidence there. I didn't need them to change for me. I just needed the space to be unchanged by them. I closed the box, taped it once, slid it beneath the bench by the window right next to my boots lined and ready for the next rotation. My fingers rested on the lid, my breath slow. Some things break and stay broken, but I stayed. And that's enough. If my story meant something to you, if you've ever sat in a room where your silence was mistaken for weakness, or your service was met with a shrug, then I hope you know this: you are not invisible. Not to me. Every quiet decision you make, every boundary you hold, every time you choose integrity over applause, it matters. Share this story if it reminded you of someone who deserves to be seen. Leave a comment if you've ever felt like you had to earn a seat at a table you already built. And if you're still standing in that room full of silence, just know staying doesn't mean surrender. It means you're writing the ending now. Thank you for watching, and thank you for staying.